let's just kind of real quick here, talk about the meninges. The meninges around the cord are basically like the meninges around the brain. Actually, they're a little bit more simple because remember that around the spinal cord, we only have one layer of dura mater. Okay, so we don't have like that periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. And notice here, if you look closely, you can see in this diagram that this is the dura mater here. Okay, it's shown in this white color. It actually is continuous with the epineurium of this nerve here. You guys remember the epineurium is the outer layer of the nerve? So it's actually continuous with that. So that means that there's a space outside of the dura mater that is an actual space. Remember that around the brain, this was a potential space, and this space is called what? Epi means outside of or on top of, right? So this is the epidural space. And so that looks a little different than around the brain. Otherwise, the meninges are all the same as around the brain. Okay? And this diagram looks like this model. This is a great model for the spinal cord because this shows, of course, shows the spinal cord itself, but it also shows all the meninges. It shows the spaces, okay? Epidural space is the one where you see the fat. And notice, if you look closely, I know you guys can't all see this from where you're sitting now, but there's this gray layer that's right up against the bone here, okay? Right up against the bone. That is actually a ligament, so just ignore that. That is not one of the meninges, okay? And you can also see a spinal nerve. Okay. So let's take a look at a picture of the spinal cord. This also shows the meninges, but you can't really see the spaces very well here. Okay, and this just goes over all of the meninges and their spaces. Okay, so looking at this longitudinal view, you can see the spinal cord and a bunch of structures that we're going to talk about now. This is the same as this model, okay? So this shows this longitudinal view of the cord. And actually, there's not really too much on this model. It's mostly just parts of the spinal cord that I would have you identify, okay? So you look at where the cord begins. You guys know it really begins at the foramen magnum. It's continuous with the medulla, so where this travels through the foramen magnum is really the beginning of the cord. It's going to travel down through the vertebral canal. So remember, each vertebra has that hole in the center, the vertebral foramen, and so together they form a canal that the cord travels through. And you can see that between the vertebrae, spinal nerves exit from the cord. They go out between the vertebrae. Okay, now it seems like the spinal cord would be as long as the spine is, but it actually is not. It ends at about L1, L2. So roughly where the L1 vertebra, L1, L2, that level is where the spinal cord ends. And it ends in this kind of cone-shaped structure called the conus medullaris. So that would look like this. The cord is actually very narrow. Most of the cord is very narrow, and that is called the conus medullaris. You can say medullary cone. Okay, either one is fine. The reason that the spinal cord ends up being shorter than the spine is just because the spine grows more quickly. And so we end up with the spinal cord ending about here. So all these spinal nerves that come off the bottom part of the cord, they're going to continue to travel down through the vertebral canal, and they'll continue going out between the vertebrae. Okay? Where they all travel together here, all of the spinal nerves kind of coming down together, they look kind of like a horse's tail. So that is called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. So those would be all of the nerves coming down from the lower part of the cord, kind of traveling together. Okay, they're called the cauda cauda equina. And then one more structure that you can see here, you have to look closely because it's very thin, shown in green. This is called the filum terminale, but this is actually the pia mater, traveling off the end of the spinal cord. You guys remember that the pia mater, just like the dura mater around the brain, it's fused to the cord. So it actually just continues off the end of the cord, and it's going to go all the way down to the coccyx. And it is attached to the coccyx. This kind of helps to hold the spinal cord in place. So it kind of anchors it down to the coccyx. So if we just picture our pia mater being attached to the outside of the cord, make this in green here also, and it's going to come down to the coccyx, okay, and attaches to that. So this is called the filum terminale. But it is actually pia mater, okay? It just has a special name in this location. So part of the reason I'm drawing this is actually, I think this area is not complicated. And if you look at the names of these structures, the name really tells you, for cauda equina and conus medullaris, it tells you what it is, right? Conus meaning cone-shaped ending. Cauda equina, if you know that that means horse's tail, that's all the spinal nerves here. But people get these mixed up all the time. And I think it's just because after the brain, there is so much to study for the brain that parts of the spinal cord just get kind of ignored. So I think this is a good thing to draw yourself and label it so that you don't get all of this mixed up, okay? A couple of other things that you can see here if you look at this diagram, and this is kind of subtle. There's a couple of subtle enlargements in the cord. They are called enlargements. There's one here in kind of the lower cervical region. This is called the cervical enlargement. This is where there are nerves exiting the cord that will go out to the upper extremity. Okay, so nerves exit to the upper extremity. Okay, and then there's another subtle enlargement here, kind of it's right above the conus medullaris. This is called the lumbar, or you can say lumbosacral enlargement. And this is where nerves exit that will go to the lower extremity. And so again, these are not like big, obvious bulges, they're very subtle. And you kind of almost have to look in the center here to see these enlargements, because this is where the spinal cord is the most narrow, is in the thoracic region. And if you find that, then you can kind of see how these are a little bit wider, but you kind of have to use your imagination. Okay, so those are the structures you can see in this longitudinal view. Do you guys have any questions on any of that? Okay. Okay, so let's take a look now at a cross-section through the cord. We'll take a look at a cut through the cord. This is all the stuff we just talked about. And this is just kind of FYI. You don't have to memorize how it looks in every different, level, but you can just see it does look a little bit different as you go through the different regions of the cord. Okay, so here's a cross-section through the cord, and we can see that, just like in the brain, the white matter and the gray matter are separate. Okay, taking a look at this anterior side, there is a deeper fissure here. Okay, the posterior side's a little bit more narrow. So this is called the anterior median fissure. This is the posterior median sulcus. And you guys know there's a little canal right in the center. What is that called?
Central canal.
The central canal. And what travels through the central canal? What's in there? Cerebrospinal fluid. This is actually continuous with the fourth ventricle. So when cerebrospinal fluid goes out of the fourth ventricle, it will go into the subarachnoid space, but also it can go into the central canal of the cord because it's going to go in both, both those areas. They're both connected to the fourth ventricle. Okay, so let's talk now about the gray matter. So the gray matter is in this kind of H or butterfly shape, and these projections are called horns. So here we have this kind of somewhat pointy posterior horn, okay, often called the dorsal. The terms ventral and dorsal are used a lot for the spinal cord, so you can use either. Neither one is correct. These are the more rounded anterior horns. And then notice they're showing you a lateral horn. Okay, so now just so you know, the posterior and the anterior horn, they are present at all levels of the cord, okay? All levels have those horns. But the lateral horn is not. The lateral horn is only present where we have autonomic neurons. This is where autonomic neuron cell bodies are located. And we'll talk about those next time. Okay, so the lateral horn, we'll just say, is autonomic only. Okay, so you might see a lateral horn and you might not, depending on what level you're looking at. Okay, so you can think of the posterior horn as being sensory, because this is where sensory neurons will enter the cord. Okay, it's where they're going to come into the spinal cord. And you can think of the anterior horn as being motor, because this is where our motor neuron cell bodies are going to be located. Okay. Okay, so now let's talk about the white matter. Notice we have white matter all around the gray. The white matter is in what are called columns or funiculi. Yes, I know that's a fun word. Funiculi. Okay, so funiculus is singular, funiculi is plural. This one back here is the posterior funiculus. Okay, posterior funiculus. You can say posterior column. That terminology is supposedly changing, where they're now referring to these as funiculi, but I think you're still going to hear the term column quite a bit. Okay, this is the lateral funiculus, and this would be the anterior funiculus, or column. So what do you think would be located in these funiculi? What type of tract? Based on the direction the axons are probably traveling. We have commissural, association, or projection. They're going to be traveling vertically, right? They're going to be connecting the spinal cord to the brain. So what type of tract travels vertically? Projection, right? These would be projection tracts. We'd have both ascending and descending. Okay, I always like to cover at least a couple projection tracts, but we don't have time to do that. I know you're all very disappointed. So you guys have some projection tracts on your list. You can take them off. Okay, so you'll see under the spinal cord, you'll see a bunch of names there for projection tracts. They will be things like the spinothalamic. You'll see, I believe, spinocerebellar is there. You'll see like the corticospinal, the rubrospinal, fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. Okay, so there's quite a few. You can take these off the list. These would be somewhere under the spinal cord. I think they're down toward the bottom of the page. If you want to read about these, if you're interested, you can check these out in chapter 17. They're in 17. And this is not something that I think will impact you in physiology. I don't think you have to worry about that. Okay, so one other thing I would like to talk to you guys about now, and that is the structure of the spinal nerve, okay? And then we will be done for today. We'll finish this stuff on Wednesday. Okay, questions on this before we go on? Okay, let's talk about the spinal nerves. And real quick, let's just go back to our spinal cord. So we said that the spinal nerves exit from the cord, they go out between the vertebrae. If you look at these, notice they are named the same way that the vertebrae are, right? With the initial of the region and the number of the nerve. So how many cervical vertebrae do we have? 7. But notice there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. This is because the first pair is way up here between the occipital bone and C1. So it gives us an extra one up there. So we have C1 through C8. Okay, now the rest of them are actually the same as the number of the vertebrae. We have 12 thoracic, so this is how they're named. We have 5 lumbar. Now notice that some of the nerves here will actually go down into the sacrum. They'll travel out through those sacral foramina. So these are named S1 through S5. And then we also have 1 coccygeal pair. The coccygeal pair of spinal nerves is right here, this lowest pair. They travel out between the coccyx and the sacrum. So this is abbreviated like this. CO for coccyx. Okay? So if you add these up, we have 31. Yay! 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So we have not talked about cranial nerves yet, but you will see when we talk about the cranial nerves that some of our cranial nerves are entirely sensory. Some of them are entirely motor, and then some of them contain both sensory and motor neurons, and that's called a mixed nerve. All of our spinal nerves are mixed, meaning they all are both sensory and motor. Okay, so all of these, they are all mixed nerves. Actually, it's the most common type of nerve in the body is a mixed nerve. So that means that the action potentials are traveling both directions in that nerve. So let's take a look at the structure of a spinal nerve. I'd like to use this diagram that we were just looking at because I think it's easier to see all the parts on that one diagram, but you can really look at any diagram that shows a cross-section through the spinal cord. Okay, so going back to this one, or whichever one you're looking at. You guys have this? Okay, so you can see here, what's going to come out between the vertebrae is the spinal nerve. So where would that kind of be located? This right here is the spinal nerve. But notice that as this approaches the spinal cord, it separates into 2 parts. Okay, so we have what is called the anterior root, or I'm sorry, posterior root and the anterior root. Okay, they're called the roots of the spinal nerve. So the roots are where the sensory and the motor neurons actually separate as they kind of connect to the spinal cord. The roots will come together though to form the spinal nerve, so the spinal nerve ends up being mixed, okay, containing both the sensory and motor neurons. Okay, so let's take a look at what travels through this posterior root. So let's put in our neurons. Okay, so just point to that here. Okay, so here we have coming in a sensory neuron. What type of neuron would this be based on its structure? This is going to be for most of our sensory information, not special senses, but the rest of our sensory would be what type? Multipolar, unipolar, or bipolar?
Unipolar.
Unipolar, right. So this is where that cell body is going to be. Remember, we kind of have to stick the cell body somewhere. It's going to be in this structure here, which is called you guys remember a collection of neuron cell bodies in the PNS? It's a ganglion, right. This is a ganglion. Okay, now that axon is going to come into the spinal cord. Remember we said that the posterior horn is sensory. So this is where that sensory neuron comes into the spinal cord. Just comes into the posterior horn, kind of hangs out there. Okay, so this is our sensory neuron. And notice that it's traveling on this posterior root of the spinal nerve. So the posterior root you can think of as just containing sensory neurons. so it's sensory only. And again, we have to have a place to stick those cell bodies. Notice they are located again in a ganglion, forms kind of a little bulge in the posterior root. So this ganglion is called the posterior root ganglion. Okay, and it would contain the sensory neuron cell bodies. And that's it. That's all that we have in there. Okay, so now let's put our motor neuron in. We said that the anterior root, or the anterior horn of the gray matter, you can think of that as being motor, because this is where our motor neuron cell bodies are located. What type of neurons are these based on their structure? Multipolar, unipolar, or bipolar? Multipolar. So this is how we draw just a simplified diagram of a multipolar neuron. Okay, so the cell bodies are going to be here, okay, in the anterior horn. The axons will travel in the anterior root of the spinal nerve. Okay, so now those two roots are coming together here, forming the spinal nerve. So notice that the spinal nerve, again, ends up being mixed. But this anterior root is motor only, okay? Contains the axons of the motor neurons. And that's it. That's all that we have in there. Okay? So posterior root is sensory. The anterior root is motor. Okay, and the spinal nerve is next. Now, the spinal nerve does have branches. These are called rami, and we will talk about those next time. I think this is, for now, it's all we're gonna cover today, but we will finish the spinal nerves. We'll talk about some nerves that go out into the body next time, and we'll also talk about the autonomic nervous system, okay? But I think for now, that's gonna be it. Now, of course, this would look the same on both sides, right? I'm just drawing it on one side. Do you guys have questions on that? This is stuff that right now I know it seems very simple, especially compared to the brain, which is good, right? The spinal cord is a lot more simple, I think, at least as far as what we're covering. But again, it's easy to get this mixed up. So don't want to just focus on the brain the whole time, okay? Don't forget to move on and study this, or, you know, get all this stuff mixed up. Okay, so what we will do now is, this is gonna be lab time. I'm gonna write some stuff about the cranial nerves on the board. You guys can copy that down. Let me know if you have questions. Everything is out, models, slides. Also, I want you guys to take a look at the sheep brain. Okay, sheep brains will be on the test. There will be a couple sheep brains out. I'll have you identify structures on those sheep brains. And you have a separate list for the sheep brains. Okay, there's a separate list in the study guide. Most of the structures, actually all of the structures on the sheep brain list, are things that you have to know anyway. Okay, so this will just help you learn the human brain also. It's basically the same as the human brain. And it's super easy, because all you have to do is just take a jar. Okay, so just